Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of QClass here at ACSM. Thank you for joining us. Today, it's definitely an honor and privilege to have one of my colleagues, Professor Emily Wilbourne, lead a discussion called Black Bodies and Black Voices, Giovanni Buonaccorsi, an enslaved Black singer at the Medici court. And this should be very interesting, and I am very curious about it, as we were just talking in our backstage about this. Emily has published many books and articles. She published 17th century opera and the sound of the Commedia dell'arte that was published by Chicago University Press. She has also written a bunch of articles appearing in Journal of American Musicology Society, Women in Music, Ricercare, Teatro e Storia. I'm always nervous talking with scholars because I know I'm going to mispronounce a whole bunch of stuff. So I apologize, Emily, ahead of time. Italian Studies, Echo, and Workplace. And it is really a great privilege and honor to work with her. And I want to present to you Professor Emily Wilbourne.
Thanks, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's really nice to share my work with the members of the Queen's community. Sometimes I think we get a little siloed, or we only talk about the senior concentration exam or something. So it's nice to talk about my academic work. So I'm just trying to share my screen here. Let me see, I'm nearly there. All right, so. The material that I want to talk about today comes from my current book project. And basically, I guess in the last 4 years, I've been working on this book. It's titled Operas Others, Voice, Race and Slavery in 17th Century Florence. And today I want to talk primarily about an individual who is central to the book project, the opera singer, Giovanni Buonaccorsi, who was enslaved at the Medici court in Florence, probably from 1651. And Buonaccorsi is shown in this painting on the right-hand side, alongside Pier Giovanni Albizzi, who was a footman who's shown here playing the lute. Now, Buonaccorsi is a really fascinating figure. When he first appears in the archive, he serves as a chamber singer in the household of the Cardinal Prince Giancarlo de' Medici, who was a younger brother of the then Grand Duke Ferdinando II. And Buonaccorsi sang in a whole series of operas that the Cardinal sponsored at the Pergola Theatre in Florence. He sung, as we see in this picture here, in the palaces themselves in a sort of more chamber music setting. And he sung at least one season on the public opera stage in Venice. And then, having outlived Giancarlo by little over a decade, by the time he himself passed away by Buonaccorsi's own death in 1674, he was part of the household of a second Cardinal Medici Prince, Leopoldo de' Medici. And we know that from this death record, which is one of the archive sources that I found when I was in Italy 3 years ago. And if we look at it here, we can see that it says Gio, which is short for Giovanni, de Buonaccorsi, Moro, which means black man, Turco battezzato, which means that he was an infidel and he became baptized into the Catholic Church. It's probably when he got the name, Giovanni de Buonaccorsi. Stava in servitù, that he was working in the service of the Signor Cardinale Leopoldo Medici, that he abitava dalla Lupica, so he lived by the Lupica, which I think is a little laneway that no longer exists in Florence, right near the Palazzo Pitti, and that he was morto con tutti sacramenti, that when he died, he got all the Christian sacraments, e fu sepolto in chiesa nostra, that he was buried in our church. This is a record from the San Felice in Piazza in Florence, and that when he was buried on this day, it says at the bottom, 15th of August, 1674, there were 10 people including clerics and priests that were in attendance. So 10 people celebrating your funeral is not nothing. So there's a certain amount of ceremony that went on at his funeral. Now, one of the reasons that Buonaccorsi is so important to my project, and I think to history at large, is that there's a relatively large number of primary sources that document parts of his life, including archive documents and early printed sources. which is rare. But one of the things that I'm hoping that my book and even this talk make clear is that as a Black or racially marked musician, Buonaccorsi himself was far from rare, not in Florence certainly, and not in other parts of Europe either. So even though what is rare is the number of details that we are able to tell about him, not his existence. Typically, when I give public talks, my audience is like primarily other musicologists or academics. And because today is a little bit different, I want to not just like make an argument or skim through the facts, but also to show something about my process, show the kinds of sources that I'm dealing with, such as that death record that we just looked at, and how we can extrapolate ideas or historical arguments from historical documents. And there is a dog howling outside my house, but it's not my dog. And I hope it's not bothering you guys, because I don't know if you can hear. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit more about Buonaccorsi. And we can start with this painting, which I first encountered in a talk that was given by the art historian Paul Kaplan back in 2015. And Kaplan in that talk did something that was really brilliant. In retrospect, it's going to sound kind of blindingly obvious, but he collated all of this information about Buonaccorsi from art historians, theater historians, and musicologists. And it turned out that each group of scholars had a little bit of information about him, and were all talking about the same individual, but they hadn't realized that everyone was talking about the same individual. So he was able to kind of pull together everything that we knew and come up with some really interesting observations about Buonaccorsi. And since then, I've gone to the archive. I've done quite a bit of archival work. And some of what we thought we knew about him was wrong. And I've filled in some of the gaps. There's still some big gaps. We don't know anything about his birth or early life, and there's his latest years. We don't really know what he was up to. But this painting in and of itself is a really important source to give a sense of just the kind of context that he was moving around in and the way in which he is being represented here. So one of the first things we can notice about this painting is that it depicts really specific individuals in a really specific place doing something that we can assume for them was relatively common. There are a couple of contemporary sources that describe the painting, and they describe Buonaccorsi as the cardinal's Moor, the sort of blackamoor, moro, this word meaning black man, or as Giovannino, the cardinal's Moor, who was a pretty decent singer. That's what one of the quotes is. He was a pretty decent singer. And the white lutenist, who's on the other side there, is described in these documents with the nickname pan bollito, which means boiled bread. It's the name of a really rustic peasant soup made in Tuscany from these old pieces of day-old bread. If you've ever eaten day-old Tuscan bread, it's like chewing on a piece of rock, but if you soak it in liquid, you can turn it into this like soup. So his nickname is Pan Bollito, and I have identified him in the archives as actually being called Piero Giovanni Albizzi, but let's call him Pan Bollito. The location, we can tell from that fountain in the background, that's the famous artichoke fountain, which is in the Boboli Gardens right outside the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. So we know exactly where the people were sitting when they painted this painting. Both these men, coincidentally enough, joined the cardinal service on the exact same day, though that may not necessarily mean anything. We also can note that those same documents that say that give us this date, 14th of September, 1651, confirm that Buonaccorsi himself wasn't actually paid. And I just highlighted here where you can see the words vitto e vestito, which means food and clothing, whereas everybody else has got like a salary number. You can see above 16,500. And on this long list of over 100 people who were in the cardinal's household, everybody else has a salary with one exception, and there are 12 singers, and Giovanni Buonaccorsi is the only one who doesn't have a salary. The only other person on this list that doesn't have a salary is the mutulo, or the deaf mute, who was kind of kept like a almost like a lapdog, like a a freak, a court freak, the way that dwarves were often kept. The dwarves almost always had a salary. The Mutolo doesn't, and Buonaccorsi doesn't. So that's why I feel that I can say that he was enslaved, because he's not getting paid for what he's doing, whereas everybody else, with the exception of the Mutolo, the deaf mute, is not. We should also pay attention here to the way, like thinking about Buonaccorsi as an enslaved man, thinking about Buonaccorsi as racially different from the other people, to this framing of the painting, which like sort of presents it. I forgot to put a slide without that writing at the bottom, but presents it as if the painters just kind of stumbled across it and snapped a very candid photo. But we can also note that there's this line right down the middle where the African man in his like very garish clothes, red and white stripes, non-European outfit is associated with the outside, whereas the lutenist who's wearing this very somber black outfit, white, very European looking outfit, is on the inside. So we see this like very subtle association that is at work in the way that the picture has been put together. And both of these men, it should be noted, are wearing very expensive outfits. The more fabric there was in your outfit, the more it costs. And so if you look at Panbolito's sleeves there, he has spent a lot of money, or someone has spent a lot of money on that shirt. And black fabric was also particularly expensive. To get fabric that was dyed that particular color was very difficult, and so therefore it was very expensive. So in this next slide that I was going to show you, I wanted to point out that like what Buonaccorsi is wearing here is really typical of court Moors, as they're called in German sources, but of, you know, Black African slaves and Black African pages who were kept in court circumstances. And most of these images come from the Medici court, and they show that these young individuals of African origin are dressed in very markedly non-European, exoticizing ways. So that is something that Buonaccorsi is wearing in his regular day-to-day life. It's also something that he wore on stage, and we have a couple of descriptions of his costumes from opera performances. Here is one. I'm going to read it to you. It says, then, oh, my little Zoom windows are covering it up. It's not useful. Iolao, the black servant of the Athenian monarch, appeared on the shore. He wore a vest of blue satin in the African style, adorned with splendid embroidery. The dark color of his black legs was covered by elegant boots of pale silver, and the many jewels adorning him at every turn denoted the grandness of his master. And it's that last point there that I really want to draw attention to. So not only is he dressed in the African style, he's covered in jewels or expensive clothes, but they denote the grandness of his master. So that the clothing that he wears and his very presence is reflecting back on, in this case, the Cardinal Prince, Giovanni de' Medici, but that it is not about his personal sense of style, but about the power and the authority of the person who owns him. I want to go back to the painting. Yeah, here we are. So from a musical perspective, one thing that we can note is that both of the musicians here are literate. They're both playing from musical examples. And we can also note that, like, alongside the violin here, there is several bound music books. So it looks like they're going to perform, you know, a number of different things. But the piece of music that they're performing right now is something that is newly composed. It's just been written down on this piece of paper and they're performing it straight away. And so given this kind of sense of newness, given the time period, this painting was painted around 1662, given the instrumentation, we have a lute, we have a solo singer, it's very likely that the genre that's being presented right at this second is a chamber cantata, which is a genre that was not widely published. It circulated in manuscript. It was really a sign of not just intimacy and access, but also of the kinds of music making that really wealthy people could afford to have put on for them, because they had these singers and musicians professional level at their like beck and call. They would come, they would put on these pieces of music. So I think that says also something very important about what this painting is representing, because this is a painting about the enjoyment of luxury goods. And you can see that both of the musicians are making eye contact with the viewer of the painting. So whoever views this painting gets to imagine that they're about to hear this performance that's put on just for them. And everything about it is luxurious. The idea of having a Black African servant is luxurious, of having private musicians is luxurious, of having the bubbly gardens outside your window is luxurious, of having your servants dressed like this, of being able to just enjoy music whenever you want, of having a chamber cantata that's been written just for you. So it's basically the equivalent of an Instagram post of somebody doing something really expensive, but passing it off as if it's every day. Although in the 17th century, they didn't have Instagram. We have instead the cardinal who commissioned someone to sit for weeks painting this painting so that he can hang it on his wall in a glitzy gold frame and then invite very select people to come and admire it. So we have this like ostentatious showing off that happens in the painting that also we can understand as a big part of the role that Buonaccorsi played in his regular life. So this is not a photo, it pretends to be a photo, but I think we're all literate enough about Instagram to understand that, and just digital media in general, that a photo is not always a photo. And a lot of what gets put out there and presented out there is very carefully framed and edited. And this is doing exactly that same thing. So by commissioning this painting, the Cardinal Giovancarlo de' Medici wants you to think that he has the kind of life where he listens to this kind of music all the time whenever he wants to. And probably he did, because he had an awful lot of money. But that doesn't mean that he's not involved in the same kind of propaganda about himself. So if we turn our attention to another category of sources about Buonaccorsi, in this case, the surviving scores and the libretti, we can note that, firstly, the operatic roles Buonaccorsi played were written for soprano. This is in like a C2 clef here. Of the 6 male singers that Cardinal Giovancarlo had, 5 of them were alto or soprano, and we don't know for sure that Buonaccorsi was castrated, but the other male singers were, with the exception of one tenor singer. So the obvious conclusion is that Buonaccorsi himself also sung castrato, but I don't have any documented proof of that, but except for the music. The second thing we can say about his roles, and this is a really important thing, is that they fell into a stock character role or a stock character type. This music that I've put up right now is the music from Buonaccorsi's entrance aria in Ercole in Tebe, which was performed in 1661, and the music is by the court composer Jacopo Melani. Now, it's in a basic A modified form, and we can see like right away that the bass line is kind of jaunty, it's moving quickly, it's like, you know, sticking around the tonic and the dominant. And he himself is complaining. E chi non scapperebbe la pazienza? Who would not be like impatient? Whose patience wouldn't escape? And then he goes on to complain about a bunch of things in his life. But given the kind of rollicking, jaunty bass line that we've got here, it's not a lament. It's definitely a sort of like joking, whinging kind of set of complaints. If we look here, like we can see that the bass line is kind of made up by a set of like very consistent formulae. Here on the top line, we have like up a step, down a third, up a step, down a third, up a step, down a third. And then over here, we've got descending, 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 descending. So we get these kind of formulae that repeat. The same thing here on the bottom line in the bass. There's also, after the A section finishes, we get an orchestral ritornello scored for 2 violins, which was really standard for orchestral opera orchestra in the middle of the century. When the rhyme scheme changes and the affect changes in like the B section, we've got to switch to triple time here. And this part probably slowed down so that he could spoof a kind of lament. He's singing, sono ahimè condannato. Alas, I have been condemned. And he's actually on the shore of the Styx. So he's up like in the underworld at the moment when he's singing this. And then at the end, the A section repeats those first two opening lines, and then it finishes. Now, his immediate launch into song, into aria rather than a recitative, marks him as a lower status character. The rhythms, the repeating melodic cells emphasize his limited expressive register as a character. And this register and also the content of what he sings is very consistent across the roles that he sings. And I'm going to show you the text of two arias. The one at the bottom is the aria that we just looked at, E chi non scapperebbe la pazienza. And the one above it is Più durare io non la posso, I can't take it any longer. And so these are two entrance arias from two different operas, the role that he sung. And you see the first one was in Act 3, Scene 3, and the second one was in Act 3, Scene 5. So like the same part of the drama, the same basic sentiment, the same basic poetic structure. We've got like an opening line that repeats at the end. We've got internal lines that are rhymed versus rhyming in pairs. And, a central affect that is just like sort of fed up with my situation. And the consistency of his characterization is even more obvious if we look at some shared scenes that he shared with Carlo Ragenzi, the one singer that I mentioned earlier, who was not also a castrato, but a comic tenor singer who played the role of a stuttering hunchback in every single opera that he performed in. So I'm going to show you 3 scenes that these two men were in together, and I'm going to step through them fairly quickly. The point is not to read the whole thing. I want to kind of point out some patterns. So this is from Il Podestà di Coloniale from 1657, and we see the two characters, Desso, the stuttering hunchback, and Moro, which is our Buonaccorsi, and they're in the dark. They don't recognize each other, and they're finally like calling for a light, and then they take the light and they look and see each other, and Desso immediately shouts, Il diavolo, the devil. I've seen the devil. So he misrecognizes Moro as a devil, and then the two of them run off, right? This is the second opera, the one that we just looked at the musical scene from, Ercole in Tebe. We have Sifone, the stuttering servant hunchback character, and we have Io Moro, the one that's Buonaccorsi, and they don't recognize each other on the banks of this river. They are on the banks of the river Styx, and as soon as Sifone sees him, he shouts, Oime un demonio. Oh no, alas, I've seen a demon, an ugly, ugly demon. So it's the devil, he's a demon. This time they don't run off. Iolao's like, oh, it's me, you know me. And then in the third opera, I'm going to show you Amore Vole in Daniel, which was rehearsed for 1663. This time Moro is hidden in a barrel, and all of these other characters are talking about the barrel, blah, 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 blah. And as soon as Desso is convinced to look in the barrel, he spots the Moro and he shouts out, Il demonio, the devil. So this consistent kind of joke, this running gag that goes from 3 separate operas in 3 separate years, all performed in Florence with these same singers, these same actors, we get this exact same scene happening. It's kind of a shtick that they had. It's not a completely neutral situation, though, to be associated with like demons or devils. Blackness has a very long history within Christian iconography, and its citation here really reflects the way that an increased familiarity with sub-Saharan Africans gave what had previously been a kind of metaphorical association of darkness with hell, gets at a really explicitly racial dimension. And here is a costume sketch for Mestra, which is an opera performed in Florence in 1658, which included a chorus of furies. There were 12 of them. They came from the underworld and they danced. And you can see here that the face of these characters is very reminiscent of caricatured Black African faces. The published description emphasizes how repulsive these figures were supposed to be. Here's a quote from the description. The Furies appeared naked with drooping bruised breasts, with blotches of putrid blood and cankers on all of their limbs. They had terrifying whirls of toads and of eels attached in strange ways to their poisoned heads, and above their rough hair, their fierce temples were bound with vipers, asps, serpents, and snakes. Now, obviously, that's not a very beautiful image. I'm pretty sure those same costumes were reused for this opera we were just talking about, Ercole in Tebe. This is the set design, and you can't, I don't know how big your screens are, maybe you see it really clearly, but if you look here, there's these characters here in the same kind of costumes. They're described as infernal monsters, and they apparently had braided snake-like hair, and they also sort of have these grotesque faces on the actual set that's also supposed to be hellish. So in this context of representing denizens of the underworld as vaguely sub-Saharan and having our Black African singer constantly like misrecognized as a demon, there is a naturalized association of racial Blackness with the underworld, with unredeemed sin, eternal torment. Although Buonaccorsi is done in a very comic scene, and the punchline is that he's not a demon, there's still this constant sort of allusions to it. And I'm going to stay with the same opera, with Ercole in Tebe, for just a little moment longer to make one further point about Buonaccorsi's stock character. And I feel a bit silly putting this scene up because unless your screen is the size of a house, I'm sure you can't read it. I'm not expecting you to read it. I'm just talking about it. So I put it up for prettiness. But in this scene, the two characters, so after Sifone realizes he does actually recognize Iolao, they have a little conversation, and Iolao says, I'm happy to leave, but I do not regret coming here. And he says the reason is that he's on the banks of the Styx, right? Seeing all these people go past into hell. And he says, I've realized that even people who are like well-behaved and seem good actually go to hell anyway. So they must have just have something secret bad with them. And then they go on, and Iolao describes several individuals, not by name, but he says, these are our friends. And then he says, do you know this one, you know, the one with the discolored face and the large beard, well, and who's always bowing. And yes, he went to hell. And did you see that woman with the, like, you know, the one with the hairdo? And so he's making reference to people, presumably literal people in the court that would have been recognizable to people in the audience, and creating the humor through mocking really specific individuals at the court. So the reason why that's important is because Buonaccorsi on stage in this opera is performing in a really explicit court jester kind of role, like mocking other people at the court that are then recognized by the audience who can let this humor like circulate, this in-crowd humor. And the one poem that we have by Buonaccorsi, this is Sogno di Giovannino Moro, Giovannino Moro's dream, or the little black Giovanni's dream, is a poem that was probably sung that does exactly that precise thing. So after the first verse, which sort of sets up the scene, describes a situation where the court is disguised as a gypsy and is telling people's fortunes. And after having told the fortunes of the nobles of the court, she decides she's going to do it also to the buffoons and the dwarves. And she comes and she tells the fortune of Scatopacchio, who was a little dwarf that was at the court, and Gabriele Martinez, who was a Spanish dwarf who lived at the court, and then of a Turkish individual called Muhammad, and then of a possibly African ex-galley slave called Kana, who also is there. So he's mocking all of these individuals in the poem, just as he does in that scene in the opera. And so on and off stage, we have this image of Buonaccorsi, performing as a court jester. And we can think about how his success as a singer and as a performer is really bound up in his long tenure at the court, his familiarity to the court, both as a kind of familiar quantity, like they know who he is, they know what he's going to do, they know how he's going to perform, but also that he knew all the other individuals at the court well enough to make fun of them successfully. And we do know that he was successful. We know that from the letters that survive about the season that he performed in Venice. Let me read, this is an excerpt from a letter sent by the Venetian impresario Vettor Caliergi Grimani. And he writes here, about the Moor, I supplicate the good grace of your highness to help me have him, since as much as I esteem his talent, even more I am banking on the novelty, the curiosità of his character, given that here in Venice, his character, his stage persona, will be new and never before seen, that which perhaps is considered ordinary there in Florence. And if the good grace of the Prince Cardinal, Giancarlo, were to favor me in this, I would send him a similar voice, or perhaps a better one. And I think there's something really interesting there, because it's not his voice that is the entire draw here. Grimani says, I've got some singers, I can send you one that's an even better singer than he is, but I want him and his particular character to come and perform here a season in Venice. And we know that he was there in 1664 for the season, because there's a letter from Atto Melani, who was himself a famous opera singer, a famous castrato, then he became a diplomat. And he wrote a letter back to Florence, to the Medici, and he said, the Moor has not had much chance to bring honor upon himself because he has had a very small role, pochissima parte, in this second opera. So maybe that means he wasn't so successful in Venice. I think it's really possible that as a kind of generic stock Black character, he was not as successful as he was in Florence, where he had this knowledge of the court and ability to tease people and mock them because he knew them so well. Once he goes to a new city, that's really different. But I also do think it's possible that he performed in Venice for several years. There's no documentation of who the singers were the following year, but it is interesting that the very next year, the same impresario staged an opera called Il Chirico, which was a reprise. So they actually put on a production that had been put on a decade earlier, which was rare. One of the things about it is it has a Black gypsy character. I've outlined it here, Fatima Mora, the schiava, vestita da zingara. So she's disguised as a gypsy or dressed as a gypsy. And he played a Black gypsy character in one of the operas that he had played in Florence. So we have this situation. Here's this impresario that's begging to have this particular Black character, actor, singer, come perform in Venice. And then the year after we know he's there, he puts on this opera that has this really interesting Black character that would have been perfect for the singer that he'd had the previous year. We don't know who his singers were that year, but I think it's really worth considering that rather than getting somebody to perform in blackface, which was the standard, I think it's really worth considering that Buonaccorsi was actually just there the next year as well. Anyway, so at this point, we've seen a variety of different kinds of historical documentation: paintings, sets, costume design, descriptions, payroll accounts, libretti, scores, letters. But most of my time in the archive, and I spent, quite a bit of time in the archive. I was in Florence 3 years ago, and I spent quite a lot of time there. I was looking through day-to-day expenditures mostly, a lot of other stuff too, but most of my time was just looking for this kind of proverbial needle in a haystack. And I spent a lot of time reading the day-to-day expenditures of the ducal camera. And this is, the camera means chamber. So this is like, mostly what I was looking at is this. And on the right-hand side, we can see how much everything cost. Florentine accounts use kind of denominatory equivalents. So these columns here, the left-hand column is ducats, or what they call a soldo, which was worth 7 lire, which is the next column. And then 1 lira was worth 20 soldi, and 1 soldo was worth 12 denari. So whatever money was circulating, and lots of different coins were circulating at the time. They would write it down in this equivalence so they could keep track of it and they could add it all up. But if we look at this list, we can see here, and it's not very legible, but that's what I spent my days doing. We see that like Pippo Ragno was paid a ducat, right? And then here we see that Il Gobbo, the hunchback, was reimbursed for a cane or a rod. We can see that Il Signor Dottore Don Julio was paid in 2 installments. If we go a little bit further down here, we see that the trombetti, the trumpet players, were tipped for some, given some money for some performance that they'd done. The next line here, it says, to the morrino, to the little black boy, un zecchino, which was a equivalent money, which is worth 10 lire. Right at the bottom of the page here, there's one that really stood out to me. It says, ai mori del signore principe Mattias per aver sonato con battistone. So that means to the black Moors, to the Moors, multiple Moors. So they could all have been masculine or masculine and feminine mixed together, belonging to Sir Prince Matthias for having played music sonato with Battistone, who was a dwarf, and they get some money for that. They get 2 ducats, the equivalent of 2 ducats and 6 lire between the group of them, however many there were. It's not entirely clear. So it's documents like this that gave me a sense of some of the quotidian activities of these individuals and really provided incontrovertible evidence that Buonaccorsi was not alone. And I'm just putting up on the screen an original list of some of the Black individuals, and I put in a couple of the Turks as well, that I encountered in the Florentine archives. And this list is nowhere near complete. I just kind of whipped it up for the PowerPoint. But this astonishing presence really overwhelmed me. I went into the archives worried that I wouldn't find anything. And instead, what I found was really fragmentary, but also really capacious. And so many of those names, all I have is just that one mention or that one name. Others, I saw the name over and over again. Other times, someone was called the Moro or the Morino with no indication of one of the evidently many that were there. So in the last few minutes of what I'm talking about today, I want to kind of address the question of like, what do you do with all this information? How do we start to put all these different documents into something that resembles history? And my undergraduate students might start to hear some bells from class where we're doing our research papers. And I'm like, your thesis, how are you supporting it with your evidence? So one of the reasons that I even thought to start looking at this project was the huge number of Black, Middle Eastern, and otherwise foreign characters in 17th century Italian opera plots. And here's an example, a single example. This is Francesco Cavalli's La Statira, Principessa di Persia, which was first performed in Venice in 1655. And this plot features members of the Persian, Arabian, and Egyptian royal families, as well as Black and Indian servants. From the perspective of modern audiences, performers, and scholars, the exotic locales and non-Italian characters of the 17th century operatic stage have been largely understood as window dressing, costumes, sets, and situations that appeal to an Orientalist desire for foreign spectacle with no consequences for the narrative or musical unfolding of the work, which remains exclusively Italianate. According to such assumptions, the series characters are just Italians in spectacular clothes and locations, and the racially marked comic characters are part of a fantasized or imagined other with little correlation to reality. Yet, if there are as many Black and racially marked Italian servants and enslaved retainers as the Florentine archives suggest, then their presence in these operas is also a reflection of Italian daily life. Racially marked or foreign-born servants and enslaved retainers were an essential feature of the Italian social and economic landscape. And the presence of such characters on the Italian operatic stage needs to be seen less as a decorative or exotic reference than as an essential component of the Italian context of performance. The stock characters of the public opera were, like the Commedie dell'arte prototypes from which they were derived, drawn from the demographic plenitude of the Italian cityscape. Educated and poetically minded young lovers, rustic servants and comic nursemaids, conniving older men, and racially marked servants. Indeed, to return to this opera here, La Statira, as emblematic of a larger phenomenon, we can note that while the essential whiteness of the main characters is presumed throughout, despite their purported Persian, Arabian, and Egyptian ethnicities, the blackness of Vafrino's skin becomes an essential component of his characterization as both comic and servile. In his very first scene, this is scene 1, Act 1, Scene 5, which is shown here on the slide, his racial identity is called out in the scene header, Vafrino Moro, or Vafrino Black African. In this scene, he sings of his burning love for Hermosilla, laying himself open to redoubled ridicule from the audience, since Hermosilla is, in terms of social status and class, way beyond his pay grade, and furthermore is actually the Egyptian prince Usibano in disguise. In conversation with his master, called Nicaro, just a few scenes later, Vafrino emphasizes his black skin, not so subtly aligning it with negative social stereotypes. Do not be fooled, signore. Under the smoke of this face, my heart burns with the purest zeal. Inside the black mine is hidden gold. A white faith resides under my black countenance. In this scene, racialization is integral to every single thing that comes out of Vafrino's mouth, as is his servile and comic status. The coherence and legibility of this figure as a representation of historical experience is thrown into relief when we consider actual Black Africans and Black Italians living, working, and making music in 17th century Italy, often under conditions of unfree labor. As was the case with Buonaccorsi, Black retainers were regularly trained as musicians, and many enslaved laborers voluntarily embraced musical performance as a respite from more brutal or physical forms of work, such as the galleons, construction, or military exercises. A recent article by the musicologist Arne Spohr, who works on early modern German sources, notes that of 380 Black court servants identified in German court records between 1573 and 1818, over 1/3 of them were engaged as musicians, specializing primarily in the military instruments of pipe, drums, or trumpet. And, interestingly enough, those instruments were they had a function that was really about their connection to political or military power. So we have the idea of the sovereign who has a trumpeter who is visibly racially marked and different, which shows that sort of domination that the army has already achieved over foreign lands, such that these people get enfolded back into the sort of authority producing sound mechanism of the trumpet itself. So in my book, I argue that the insistent association on and off stage of Black bodies and Black voices with comic servants, and therefore with the lower class status of the characters and of the musical forms that such individuals sang, and again, they're singing on and off stage, help naturalize assumptions that presumed Black aptitude for servitude as a heritable biological defense of their enslavement and dispossession funneled through musical sound. The genre of opera was invented in Florence at the beginning of the 17th century. The very premise of opera is the idea that musical sounds convey meaning and emotional affect better than mere words, that the sounds emerging from a given body tell us something about the truth of that body. Thus, in 17th century Italian opera, you can tell which character is the prince and which character is the servant in disguise from the sound of their voice. And so the fact that Buonaccorsi's voice is only allowed to sound in these certain genres of song and in these certain repertoires as the court jester means that there's an assumption that gets carried along with it that is what the only thing that voice is capable of doing. Historically and theatrically, these operas and the lives of individuals such as Buonaccorsi foreshadow in musical sound what Saidiya Hartman has called the appropriately simple tones of the enslaved. Writing about 18th and 19th century North American chattel slavery, Hartman has argued that the enduring association of Black bodies and a natural ingrained musicality was taken as evidence for the unaffected simplicity of the Black mind and thus their aptitude for enslavement. Sylvia Wynter has argued that the humanist logics of the Italian Renaissance provided, quote, a model for the invention of a by nature difference between natural masters and natural slaves, end quote. And in the humanist genre of Florentine opera and the songs of Black and other racially enslaved laborers in Florence, we can hear the construction and naturalization of precisely that difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That was fantastic. And thanks also just for, it was a pleasant surprise to know the process, sorry, because it was just interesting to hear like the unfolding, like just the looking at that painting and just pulling all that in and informing, information. I mean, I feel stupid all the times I've been to a museum all of a sudden and haven't looked that deep into it. So it's exciting. I can't wait to get to go to a museum again and try that skill. So thank you for opening up that world for us.
Oh, you're so welcome.
So Jane, I'm not sure. Sometimes we have questions, sometimes we don't. But if anybody does have questions, Jane.
Right now, the room is exploding with the applause.
Applause, yes, of course.
Congratulations! It's just bravissima, bravissima, and bravo. It's people are just screaming.
Screaming into the abyss of the nothingness of the internet.
That was really fascinating. Thank you so much for doing this with us this time, and we hope that we were saying maybe we can do more in this area. This would be interesting to hear what people are doing in their free time, as it were. Thanks, and I would like to say that everybody have a great Thanksgiving. We won't have one of these next week, and we'll be back. I think 2 weeks after that with David Jolly doing our faculty David Jolly doing a brass masterclass, which should be just wonderful as well. So thank you again, Emily. Great, and also thank you, Carlos, Jane, and Justin, who always do a great job.
Carlos,
I'm sorry, I always
thanks,
forget
Justin.
to mention. And that was just excellent. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.